Carson, Leno, Fallon. Now, it's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today, about to have a conversation with Gavin Sacks all the way out in, Cornell, New York.
That's correct. Ithaca, New York.
That was pretty good.
Home of Cornell University. Well done.
Hey, the introductions in just a moment. Have a listen to this podcast I just did with Kristen Maddalena, since we're talking academics here today. Kristen has a PhD in history, but is an Italian export world representative for the Ciro Pacenti winery in Montalcino. And folks, if you go to Italy and you're going to travel to the wine country, Montalcino is one of these unbelievable places where the history and the lifestyle explains what goes on in their wines. No magnanimous chateau, no magnanimous resorts, just pure, simple, humble winemaking. It's a fabulous conversation with Kristen Maddalena. Also, subscribe to the show with your favorite platform. If you got something good to say, go ahead and say it. If you don't, keep it to yourselves. Wine Talks is published twice a week, so there's lots to listen to and always going on. And we don't just talk to winemakers, we talk to interesting people, as today with Gavin Sacks. Okay, you're professor of food science at Cornell University, and
I'm also associate chair of our department and located within the College of Ag and Life Sciences here at Cornell University. Our communications people love it when I put in the full title that I have and take a shout out for our college here.
You know, I think I told you last time when we spoke a little bit that I had a young intern here, Lisa, and her job was to write the talking points for the female winemakers, since female people of color and women in wine is such an important subject in our industry, that she got inspired enough and applied to Cornell and was accepted, and it's her first year this year. And I'm kind of proud, that I may have something to do with this.
Yeah. I just spoke with her advisor, and she's really happy to have Lisa as part of our program. I've yet to meet our new freshman students, but I look forward to having Lisa in a class next year on wine analysis.
So let's talk about that. The department, which is food science, is it the School of Enology and Viticulture part of that school? And then does every freshman or every sophomore need or have to take a class from you regarding this?
So we have a shared interdepartmental major shared between our Department of Food Science and the School of Integrative Plant Sciences, which would include horticultural sciences, plant pathology, plant breeding. And so students who wish to major would take classes with faculty in both departments and the school. So the course requirements would look pretty similar to what you might expect to see from a viticulture enology major at other institutions that have viticulture enology majors. The first couple of years are core requirements primarily in the life sciences, physical sciences, data literacy, as we call statistics now. So students would take their general chemistry, they're going to take introduction to biology, they're going to take microbiology and biochemistry. And then as they work their way through the program, starting in their first year, but continuing all the way through their second year, third year, fourth year, they will take advantage of our resources here. We have a teaching winery / distillery / brewery here in our building. We have orchards and vineyards at 2 locations, one very close to campus. Another is a nicer site further up Cayuga Lake, more moderate climate. Tends to have less extreme winter lows. And that's the first rule of viticulture, especially here in upstate New York, is doesn't matter what your soil is, don't kill the grapevine because it got too cold. And so we've got a couple of different sites. Can't make good wine if you don't have any grapes. So we have a couple of different sites, and the students from early on first year will take these courses, but as they move through the curriculum, they're given more and more independence. Once they get to their upper level courses, the questions often come as, well, what do you want to do? What things are you interested in? Because eventually, the way I see this degree, we're not just training people to be winemakers and grape growers. We're training scientists. We're training people who know how to seek out questions and figure out the right way to answer those questions. And we're using wine and grapes as a tool to go about that. And it's a really good tool. We've got everything from growing the raw material to transforming it into a value-added product, eventually figuring out how to market and sell that product. You see the full scope of agriculture, food, and business. When you do that, it's a wonderful major for people who are interested in all of those, maybe interested in wine and grapes at the same time. And we can put people in positions where they can succeed in that. But many of our majors move on to other careers, often in something related to value-added agriculture, but not necessarily just wine and just grapes.
That is fascinating. You said a ton there, not the least of which is, isn't it dangerous to give college students access to a still in the fermentation sciences to, instead of going down to the local liquor store?
Yeah. That's dangerous as well. I can guarantee you, we don't just hand them a little index card and say, okay, we'll see at the end of class. The students earn our trust for independent operation of the equipment. But New York state law says that so long as a student is taking a class 4 credit to satisfy a major requirements, they can be under the age of 21 and not just make alcohol, but also consume that alcohol, which is fantastic news for our majors. People put that on the books for us. Culinary Institute of America lobbied for that. We had that in Hyde Park, a few hours to the east of us. So we're grateful to them for pushing that through several decades ago.
You said something interesting about grapevines in New York, and there's been a huge awareness of the Finger Lakes and Long Island and all kinds of wines. In fact, I interviewed a master of wine recently in Napa, and she makes wine in 3 places. She makes wine in Napa, she makes wine in New York, and she makes wine in Ohio. It's really interesting from a historical standpoint because it was one of the original replanted locations in the U.S. after Prohibition. Yep. But what you said about New York, not killing the vine with cold, when I was there, I think in 94, and I was in Millbrook, and I mean, talk about a labor of love. You see these people outside with dry suits on in 3 feet of snow, pruning their vines.
Yeah.
In an area you would think, man, you're never really going to get really good wine out of there, but apparently things are changing there.
Yeah. And so there's a few reasons. There's much better viticultural practices now. There's so why didn't we have vinifera growing 100 years ago to the extent? I mean, there might have been little plantings here or there, but we didn't have commercial operations 100 years ago growing vinifera in upstate New York, Hudson Valley, Lake Erie, Finger Lakes. There's been improvements in our knowledge of viticulture and how to have healthy vines. There's improvements in knowledge of how to do grafting under extremes. People will hill up to protect the graft union. But one of the other changes, this has hurt a number of regions, but there's, as often said, there's winners and there's losers with climate change. Our winter lows are not as low as they used to be back in the 50s and 60s. That's also helped the upstate New York industry. I don't really think that's a reason to start releasing CO2 just for the heck of it. Yeah. But having our winter lows and looking at, for example, our USDA zone number, and that we don't get to -20, -15, even -10 as regularly as we used to. And there's a number of grapes where it's the difference between viable and non-viable. If you get to -5 for like Cabernet Franc, Cabernet Sauvignon versus -10, that's where a lot of this severe damage and bud death starts to come in. So yeah, combination of improved technology, improved knowledge, but maybe also one of the good side effects of climate change.
That has happened all over the world. Take England for a second, making incredible world-class sparkling wine.
But I can say on the downside, this past year we had several producers, both for tree fruits in particular, but also for grapes, who were affected by one of the downsides of climate change, which was a false spring and a late frost in May, and certain sites were devastated by it.
Explain the USDA zone number for the listeners.
Oh, sure. And you're asking an enologist/chemist to do this. So I encourage your listeners to go Google everything I say.
Well,
USDA has a map of recommended of recommendations for what to grow where based on winter lows, because the low temperatures are often what limits your ability to grow a crop. Coffee production in upstate New York is not going to work. Coffee production in most of the United States is not going to work. And so the zone numbers start low for the coldest climates and then get higher and higher and higher. Depending on where you are in the Finger Lakes or upstate New York, you're probably 5A or 5B. I don't know actually California all that well, but as you go from north to south, those numbers go up and up and up, and they correspond typically with the expected winter low temperatures for that region. And that provides us some guidance then based on different cultivars of what's appropriate or not appropriate to grow, or to facilitate site selection. Your soil could be amazing. Your spot can be beautiful. If it's going to get down to minus 20 Fahrenheit routinely, that's going to be a very tough place to grow vinifera.
Is that the opposite of the UC Davis heat days? I mean, where
that is, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's focused on the other aspect, which is how much temperature do you accumulate over the growing season. So New Zealand would be a nice example of a place that doesn't get all that cold during the winter, but also doesn't accumulate all that much heat.
Right.
It's very, and so this is common for maritime climates. They tend to be much more moderate, as opposed to continental climates, other extreme. Midwest of the United States, they can accumulate a lot of growing degree days. That is, how often does the temperature exceed 50 degrees Fahrenheit by how much? But their winter lows can be devastating. And so that winter low is what limits your ability to produce something like Cabernet Sauvignon or other vinifera in the Midwest and in New York State. It's often how cold are you going to get, not how much warmth did you have during the growing season.
So interesting, because, after Prohibition, I think I mentioned it earlier, the first place the government went to regenerate the wine trade was Louisiana, Ohio, Michigan, planting muscadel and other indigenous, not indigenous, we don't have them, but they're not even vinifera for the listeners. That's the wine making grape classification, Latin classification. So it was Vitis Lambrusco, things like that, but making insipid wine. But it just fascinates me that that's what we knew to do instead of actually using these scales that we're using. Pardon me. Go ahead. There is a lot of pressure that climate change has put on all growing regions of the world. California, not as much. In fact, California is 2 months late almost in their harvest this year, instead of 2 months early, what you would have in Burgundy. And like you said, there's been some benefits there. Not to outweigh the negatives, but areas of Burgundy now that were producing average wines are now producing great wines, and parts of Europe, like London or Sussex in England, are producing some amazing things. So have you followed that much? As far as like climate change in the districts of the world, is that something that we don't do at the school necessarily?
We certainly study that. I mean, again, since I teach the enology classes, I talk a little bit less about some of the viticultural issues that you're referring to. But one of the I would call it a joke, except it's not really a joke, is if you want to know what challenges you're going to have in New York, look at what Pennsylvania and Maryland are experiencing. If you want to know what challenges you're going to have in Maryland and Pennsylvania, look at what challenges Virginia and North Carolina are having, and so on. So things like Pierce's disease are steadily going further and further north because they get killed off by cold temperatures. That's going to be more of an issue going forward. We might have fewer issues of winter kill, but we're going to have more issues of things like sour rot or too high nighttime temperatures, which can result in lower acid levels, lower color, less anthocyanins. So what we're seeing is, and what you should expect, is just a general shift north of problems, but also potentially more extremes. And so when we have extreme rainfall or extreme snowfall events, are we prepared for that? And that goes both on the viticultural side, but how about on the winemaking side? What would you do if in the middle of harvest, you knew that not once every 50 years, you were going to end up with 5 to 10 inches of rain, but maybe it becomes an every 1 to 5 year occurrence? How would that affect the way you're doing your operations now? And so people refer to it as climate resilience. The way I see it is thinking ahead about what your problems are going to be 5 to 10, maybe even longer down the road, because it's not cheap to make investments for a winery. That's not the sort of thing where you want to be pulling up vineyards every year to adjust. What things can you do now to put yourself in a position to succeed in another decade from now?
Interesting, because I've had this question, and you'd be the perfect person to answer it. Now that we're using phenolic ripeness, along with bricks and sugar content for grapes, but we're seeing a shift in the number of days for ripening, and the number of days for what's it called, bud break, and sometimes harvesting early, sometimes harvesting late. And so I've always wondered, it maybe can't be done. Maybe you can't compare what would have been a conventional growing season and the phenolic ripeness of that grape versus one that went through a current situation where they had to be harvested earlier than normal, but it started earlier than normal, and would they be different grapes? So they're always going to be different grapes, but do we know how it's affected what we are getting out of the grapes?
Oh boy. So it's So let me try to make sure I understand the question. If you have a situation where you've got the same region and you could magically do an experiment where that's your control, but then you have a treatment where you increase the temperature for both daytime and nighttime by 3 to 5 degrees, and from early in the season on, and then you harvest both at the same. You're basing everything off sugars, and then you compare those wines. What happens? Well, the challenge is that we don't have a way to create that experiment. What we can try to do is extrapolate. Often a lot of the extrapolations based on comparing grapes from places that are nearby, but having different enough weather in a given year where you can try to make comparisons. So that becomes less of a climate comparison and more of a year-to-year weather comparison.
Right.
We drive 100 miles up the road in the Central Valley, and it's this much warmer, and we go, or actually go the other way, go this much further south, and it's this much warmer as compared to north. How do things on the average compare? Yeah, I mean, there's a general idea, and probably even on the wine appreciation side, you have a general idea of what to expect. Based on, for France, you have an idea of what to expect from the Languedoc region versus other regions of France, even with the confounding problem of they don't always grow the same grape varieties. But you can find some Pinot grown in the Languedoc, and you can compare it to what you get from Burgundy. You have the same thing going on in you have the same thing going on in California, where you can compare what you might be getting at, say, a $6 to $8 price point for a California Cabernet or Merlot versus something from further up the valley going towards Lodi and then eventually into Napa. So you have a general idea already of what you might expect based on just sugar maturity informing that. The problem is, of course, not everything is controlled there, but you can make some guesses of what might happen if you had warmer temperatures on average, and we can do that here in the East Coast by comparing what we have to what Pennsylvania produces, and Pennsylvania compare themselves to Maryland, Virginia, and so on.
Is there it just came to my head as we're talking about this, because the enologist Michel Roland will tell you when he walks into your vineyard for the first time and you've never grown grapes there, you can do it because of the following conditions. However, it'll take us 100 years to figure out what's going to work. And that's just the evolution of the wine business. But is there an academic molecular study of grapes that isn't necessarily used by wineries in the lab, used by people in the field, but gives information to molecular DNA type scientists that are trying to figure things out?
So we're still going outside of my area. One of the, but I'll try my best.
Now, I promise we're going to get there.
One of there's several groups that have been working on it. The idea of having a molecular clock for grape maturity. So right now there are scales based for grape maturity based on visual observation of phenology. So what does that mean? That means you look at what the grape looks like, and then we've got a reference for here's what bud break stage blank looks like, and there's different numbered stages. And here's another one for flowering, and here's another one for fruit set when it's the tiniest little berries versus pea size. And so there are dozens of these numbered stages. I'm forgetting how many. It's in the 40s or 50s, I think, maybe more than that. And it requires someone trained, usually, to look at the grapes and look at the reference, and people will generally be in agreement with each other within a stage or two. You potentially could train AI to do this as well. But you have some researchers saying, no, instead of using these visible stages, what we should be able to do is use either protein expression or RNA expression. In other words, the DNA's job, DNA doesn't change all that much. There's going to be parts of it that are going to be changed a little bit, but DNA's role is to provide the blueprint for making proteins, and proteins do all the work. Those are the enzymes. So based on you think about our bodies, we're making different proteins in our bodies depending on where we are phenologically. We need different things when we are a brand new infant versus when we're a toddler versus going through adolescence and so on. It's no different for a grape. And there's some researchers now looking at trying to use this as a more robust clock for the maturity of a grape to figure out what stage it's at, whether that could then be used for anything other than just research purposes, whether it could be useful to, say, a grower or winemaker to know where a grape is during the process, or if something's gone out of sync and protein expression that should be lined up isn't lined up. That's a great question. That's an active area of research. But then it goes beyond just visible observation or measuring chemical compounds, but looking at where they are from a maturity standpoint, based on gene expression, based on which proteins we're expecting to be formed.
That's fascinating. It sounds like it is something you understand.
I've been to a couple talks, and so apparently I'll pretend I'm an expert, and so one of those people who actually are working on it shows up.
Call you out. Because I always wonder, it's not a question, but I always wonder what the end game is. What are we trying to do? The monks of Burgundy were making wines based on what they could observe. That's all they had. And they produced amazing wines. They were able to identify amazing plots of land that produced better Pinot Noir than others. And so I always ask winemakers, what's your end game? What are you trying to do? You just trying to express what you're given best? Are you trying to manipulate something? And so that'll lead us probably more into your area of expertise and what we're trying to do in the marketplace. Some things have revealed over the years that, through studies and reading, and things like the cork, which has gone through some evolution in the last few years. It's a technology that hadn't changed for like 350 years and erroneously been associated with Dom Perignon, the monk himself, having created it, but it's not really the case. But now we're dealing with screw caps, we're dealing with synthetic corks, we're dealing with foam corks, and who knows what else is coming down the pike. But glass has been around for a long time. I think probably a couple thousand years at least. And, the preferred closure for wine, at least today. But we were talking last time about what it takes to make a glass bottle, the carbon footprint, the recyclability, all the things that go into today's sociological issues. And canned wines are becoming, there's a lot on the shelf. They're ready to drink cocktails, Tetra Paks. And I think I mentioned to you, I have a plastic bottle of wine from this 87 or 88 or something that has this disgusting coating on the inside. So tell me what your study at Cornell is. What are you working on?
Yeah, well, as you brought up, one of the things that keeps wine chemists and enologists in business is whenever a new technology gets introduced, there's going to be problems, which is good. That's job security for us. So yeah, if everything's always stayed the same, I'm not sure if you actually would need to have wine chemists. So if you go 30, 40 years ago, cork sealed glass packaging dominated the wine market. It's not easy to find numbers, but easily more than 95%, perhaps more than 98%, 99% of wines by label were going to be packaged in glass. There was a handful of wines in plastic, a handful of wines under alternative closures, but not much. It was effectively a monopoly on the options available for consumers. And this starts to change during especially during the 90s into the 2000s, with the rise of what were then called alternative closures, although at this point they're mainstays. It's hard to still call them alternative closures. And alternative meant anything that was an alternative to a single piece of cut cork, cut from a piece of cork wood. And so in one form, this could be ground up particulates of cork that were then glued together. It could be those same particulates of cork that were pre-treated in a way to remove potentially compounds that potentially would taint or cause off aromas in the wine. These still look like cork, and they were still primarily cork. There were others that still look like cork, at least from their shape, but as you mentioned, have other materials making them up. So synthetic corks made out of different types of polymers. Screw caps, which have been around for a while, but had not entered mainstream usage. These still represent a minority of wines on the market. The majority of wines still are glass packaged, cork finished. But those alternatives are now, it's still hard. It's kind of hard to call them alternatives because they're so widespread. So you also find alternatives to glass, not just alternatives to cork closures for glass packaging. Those alternatives include plastic bottles. Those have been around for a while. They're usually made out of polyethylene terephthalate or PET. We also have Tetra Pak, as you brought up, which is an example of multi-laminate packaging. Multi-laminate just means multiple layers, sort of like plywood. Only instead of only being made out of wood, you're going to have multiple layers of plastic with a cardboard backing and usually an aluminum layer somewhere to provide a good barrier. Bag-in-box is an example of multi-laminate packaging. Not the box part. That's just there to provide some structural support. The bag is not a single piece of plastic. Rather, it's multiple layers of different plastics, each with different functional roles. Maybe to act as a water barrier, to provide mechanical stability so it doesn't all fall apart, or to provide a good material to put some sort of labeling on. This is not a single piece of plastic. It's multiple layers. Okay. This brings us then to what our group's been working on, which are aluminum beverage cans. So the same material that would be used to make a Coke or a Sprite can. The earliest references that I know of for using cans for canning wine go back to the 1930s. Those original ones, though, were tin plate iron. They were not aluminum. There's not much mention of them other than they were not much of a commercial success. They seem to have had corrosion issues early on. And there were sporadic attempts over the next several decades, going into the 80s, of people attempting use of cans in wines, having poor success in doing so. Most of the results that, if there were any results in studies, showed up more in trade journals or in patents rather than in the scientific literature. And this starts to change. In the early 2000s, with the rising popularity and release of Sofia Coppola's sparkling wines in cans, and those are still available, but that's the dawn of the modern era of canned wines. And I don't work myself on the marketing or sales side. I ask my students, do you drink canned wine? And almost all of them do. They're mostly in their 20s if they can legally drink wine. And I'll ask why. And they'll say, well, there's a few things. Number one, I'm at a party. Everybody else has beer or cider or a canned cocktail. Then I want to have a can too. It's convenient. It doesn't spill. It doesn't look weird, not a place to have a glass when everybody else has a can. If we're going out camping, we're going to a pool. Chances are I'm not even going to want to bring glass there. It's heavy. If it breaks, there's going to be some problems. It may not be allowed. And then the other is, if I just want to have wine, I can buy a can of wine. I can't do that easily with bottles. Yeah, you can find splits if you're lucky. But there's not a whole lot of options right now for 187s, 375s in glass. There's a lot of options, of course, for those formats for canned wine. So portion size, portion allocation can work well for them as well. And then the final part also is there's some really nice packaging things that you can do for canned wines. You can decorate everywhere, as opposed to glass where you usually have a tiny little label. With all your information, with the can, it's much easier to find designs that lend the entire can package to something exciting and interesting to look at. So our research. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Go ahead.
Yeah. So our research is, again, once you introduce a new technology, there'll be problems. And starting back in the 1980s with some of the patent literature, people had noticed that when you had wines stored in aluminum cans, they were prone to developing hydrogen sulfide. So H2S, smell of rotten eggs. So cans are an extraordinary hermetic barrier. That is, you don't worry about oxygen getting into a can. There was some fantastic work on the brewing world looking at that. Cans are better than bottles at keeping air out. The main challenge often with canning is making sure you don't accidentally introduce air during the canning process. But once you do that, no more air should get in. We call an aluminum can an aluminum can. I'm just looking around to see if I've got an example. easily, but easy to show you. But you can Google this online of liner aluminum can, and you might be able to find pictures. The aluminum can is actually a plastic bag. The can is just there to support this very, very thin plastic bag. It's called a liner that's applied to the inside. How thin? A few microns. To put that in perspective, a human hair is usually 100 to 200 microns. You get a plastic water bottle that's usually 100, 200 microns thick. So this is the reason why aluminum cans are more sustainable. The aluminum is readily recyclable. There's great recycling streams. There's deposit fees. Aluminum upcycles. It takes less energy to remake an aluminum can than it did if you start from aluminum ore, bauxite. And so that small amount of coating on the inside can easily be burned off. That coating is there to keep your wine or other beverage from coming into contact with the aluminum. Most beverages, picture a Coca-Cola, pH of 2.5, very acidic. It is going to corrode and, speak colloquially, eat through a can if there's no liner in place. But these thin liners are all you need to keep a Coca-Cola or a Sprite from doing that, from corroding a beverage can. The problem is with wine, for reasons that we've been working on, this barrier fails. It may not fail immediately, but it will fail faster than it would with a Coke or a Sprite, even though those soft drinks are at lower pH, more acidic than wines are. And so we got involved to understand, why is this happening? Why do we get hydrogen sulfide showing up? Why do we have issues of corrosion sometimes occurring within maybe a few months, maybe 6 months, maybe a year, maybe even longer? Why is it unpredictable? What is it about wines, or at least some wines, that's causing this failure?
Well, let me put it in the layman's viewpoint, because I set out about 5 years ago. Well, first of all, I stocked the shelves of my dad's liquor store with screw caps, 1975, 74, 73, and that's, of course, was Gallo's Rhine wine, stuff like that. And so, it's a slow industry to make changes in the ambiance of cork. We'll talk about it in a little bit. But in the 80s, I sold hop years, illustrious career, to the manufacturer of the canning line that 7-Up used. And so these incredible machines that were bottom and top fillers, things. Let's just start with that. How has that lining changed, let's say, from the mid 80s?
So if you had asked me that question, how have liners changed since the mid 80s? If you had asked me that 10 years ago, I would have said they haven't.
Really?
The material that was used in the mid 80s was the exact same as the material that was used with almost any canned beverage up until a few years ago. And that material is bisphenol A based epoxies, or BPA based liners. This was developed, I think in the 50s and 60s. There's other liner materials available that were used before then, and occasionally after then, there's ones based on PET, others based on acrylic. But BPA epoxy provides an extraordinary barrier, highly impermeable, very strong, very tough. It's mechanically strong, so you can kind of like squish on the bottle and you don't have to worry about it breaking and rupturing. It's chemically inert. The problem is that there have been concerns recently about the health effects of BPA, and particularly their ability to act as endocrine disruptors. So their potential effect on normal human growth, especially anything associated with endocrine functions. And so for this reason, although the US government has not outlawed BPA with the exception of products that are designed for infants, other locales, for example, California, now requires anyone who has a product with BPA in it as a food contact material, as these liners are called, to label on it, warning, this product has materials that are been associated with endocrine disruption. And I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but you can imagine that that's a turnoff to potential consumers. And so most consumers, not just of wine, but of other beverages, if they're distributing into California, which is a lot of producers, whether it's for Coca-Cola or wine or otherwise, they have started looking into new types of materials as liners. Some of these are old materials that have been repurposed, like PET and acrylic. Others are new types of epoxies that don't use BPA. There's been a lot of work over the last few years to figure out whether these can deliver the same performance as BPA epoxy. And so that's been the big change, is a phasing out of BPA epoxy and an introduction of non-BPA, or what's called BPA-NI, BPA non-intent type coatings, some which don't perform as well as BPA and some which perform pretty comparably to BPA.
So is this a problem with these compounds, these liners leaching into the beverage, or molecularly changing something in the beverage that causes these problems?
Yeah, the main concern from a health perspective is migration, which we call leaching. That is components of the liner or that were used for its manufacture migrating into the beverage. So you start off with monomers, that is small individual molecules. To make a polymer, you stitch them together. But when you do that, often not every monomer gets reacted. Potentially, you could have degradation of the liner too, where the big long chains become smaller monomers. But often, even the initial synthesis, you didn't necessarily get rid of every monomer. That's the main concern. There's regulations regarding maximum limits at the federal level for these materials. But other places like in Europe, California are taking a more rigorous stance on this.
Is this migration inevitable no matter what you come up with? And as we've seen through technology in all industries, as they change, we find an issue with one. I heard a Paul Harvey story the other day. The guy that invented ketchup, was told you're whack, and that turns out to be like this nutritious food. So are we constantly looking at these ideas to mitigate the migration? Because I was thinking about something. You have a lot of students, you talk to them, you ask the questions like, do you drink canned wines? These last few generations have been pretty health conscious. My daughter was in town. She lives in Potsdam, New York. It's not the edge of the world, but you can see it from there. And she as soon as we pulled out a Teflon pan, we weren't allowed to cook with that, which I agree with her on this, but nothing is in plastic. She only buys bottled water and in glass. And so this generation, starting, I think, with the millennials and even more recent, has been very conscientious about what they ingest. How does that play out with those conversations with your students?
So I think that if they have an aversion to a particular kind of food contact material, things that are visibly plastic give them more pause. So I brought the PET bottles, for example. That would probably cause more concern among the students. They generally, I haven't seen a ranking, but in terms of the perceived healthiness of different types of packaging or health concerns, I suspect glass is pretty high up in terms of perceived healthiness, but followed pretty closely by metal, and with plastic packaging as a distant, a third in that ranking in terms of perceived health or lack of concern. Although what I also tell my students during classes, the beginning and the end for health concerns with wine needs to always be the ethanol. There's there is well-documented evidence that excessive consumption of ethanol has negative health effects. There is no debate with that. Don't fool yourself into thinking that there's some sort of halo that by having the right kind of packaging or right kind of cup with ceramic or glass or something else, that you're going to cancel out excessive high-risk alcohol consumption. That's boring, right? But it misses the point. My main concern often with these discussions is that they miss the point that excessive high-volume consumption of alcohol is the major health concern here, as opposed to trace level migration of plastics, where we've got some evidence of potential problems as opposed to the very clear evidence of the former.
So this romantic opinion of mine and my romantic outlook of wine, which is, it's been around for thousands and thousands of years. It's always in the generationally they always come back somehow to that glass of wine that makes them feel something, that makes them remember a story, their visit to the Parthenon, whatever they've experienced that wine can do, versus packaging, health concerns. I mean, the alcohol problem, like you just mentioned, has been around since, like they just found that a queen in Egypt, they've unearthed her tomb and they found hundreds of jars of wine with the grapes. I can't wait to find out the DNA of these grapes and what they find out about their fermentation processes. But so from a marketing guy, which is what I do and did, let's just take an example. Somebody comes in with this beautiful high punted glass, thick glass. It's some major brand in Napa, and they go, "Wouldn't this cool? Look at the great glass." I'm like, "No, it's £5. It's going to cost me more to ship it to my customers, and I can't charge them anymore." So I have a more practical, expense-driven opinion of this. But the proliferation of Tetra Paks, cans, plastic bottles, alternative closures, I'm just wondering if it's not a fad, but something that just is part of the whimsical part of marketing and the generational differences. And is it here to stay? If it's here to stay, what are we going to do to continue making this, I'm not going to say healthier, because I don't think it's unhealthy, but continue growing the length of the shelf life of a canned wine?
Yeah. So I mean, I look at one of the questions I always pose to my students is how many wines do you think get approved for sale every year in the United States? Because we can look this up. You must do a certificate of label approval. You must get your label pre-approved by the federal government if you wish to sell a wine.
That's right.
Sell a wine in the United States. And so you can look this up. It's an extraordinary number. It's last
like
time
110,000 last year.
What was that again?
I think last year was 110,000 or something.
Yeah. And so that's every year. And many of these wines are vintage products. So you figure there's 500,000 to 750,000 different wines floating around the United States right now. And first of all, I always laugh and say, "Hey, so what's the best wine?" Like, clearly. I haven't tried them all yet. Come back to me in a bit and I'll let you know. So clearly that's not the goal here. It's not to have a best. I see wine as a great big ecosystem. And within that, it's not just the ecosystem of, I like only dry premium red versus I like only sparkling flavored things that are more like a hard seltzer than they are like wine. No, you have people, and I say this for myself, but I say this looking at my students and friends. They treat it like, I think a lot of people do hamburgers. So sometimes I want a hamburger from a fast casual the equivalent of an In-N-Out in California. There's sometimes when I want to pay a lot of money and go to a nice restaurant for a hamburger. Sometimes when I make that hamburger at home. That doesn't mean that there's something wrong with me when I like one kind of hamburger. It's like with wine. There's going to be times for people who buy canned wine or Tetra Pak wine where the environment is right for that. And other times when they're going to spend a lot of money on a high-end wine experience. And other times they're going to do something in between. And that's what makes wine so interesting, is that diversity. It's not just that it's a flaw that we tolerate. That's the appeal of wine, is that it tries to be a lot of different things. This canned wine thing, if you go to a cafe in Paris and get the cheap red from Beaujolais, was there something wrong with that wine? Nothing, not at all. It fit that environment. It makes sense there. It's made sense there for a long time. And those same people who love that wine might also like other kinds of wines at other events or at other times. So I like to think that it's not a choice of do I want a can versus or a Tetra Pak versus. Rather, it's you want to make sure that wine, and both wine styles and wine packaging, can be a lot of different things to people who are in different places, different circumstances, as opposed to saying, I'm only going to be one thing, this experience. And if you don't like that, then we can't help you.
But I wonder if that's sociological, right? Because I'm a big cocktail guy in the sense of I love crafting them. I love learning about the history of them, the Manhattan and New York, et cetera, et cetera. And sort of that's part of my experience. Maybe because I'm an old guy, that's part of what I like to do. When I was in Paris 2 weeks ago and I was teaching the bartenders how to make the proper Manhattan, So, and now ready to drink cocktails, which are a lot of them are in cans and some are going in bottles. And so I get this sort of conflicting packaging concept, because here this person's spending a lot of money on a little octagonal 200 ml bottle to make their drink look sophisticated, and their competitors got a 375 milliliter can with this stupid circle on it, and a Helvetica script looks terrible, but it's the leading brand. And I wrestle with this. I try to figure out what, maybe you're right. Maybe it's the environment that drives the packaging use and what they want to do with it.
Yeah, and this is also I saw the Brewers Association had a recent announcement about concerns about declining craft beer sales.
Yeah,
and this is not because everyone's becoming a teetotaler. People are drinking about the same amount of alcohol once you scrub out some of the COVID noise. But in the same way that wine saw itself first take market share away from liquor and domestic non-craft beer starting in the 80s into the 90s, and then craft beer started taking away market share away from wine. Now you're seeing cocktails and canned cocktails taking away market share. So some of this is going to be trends and fads and the noise that's associated with it. I don't know where that's going to go, but clearly right now that's satisfying the convenience need that some people have for alcohol, and it's not something that I seek out, but it is interesting, and I know I certainly have students who like having that convenience with when they make their drink purchases.
Well, it's bad. It's back to job security, right? So it doesn't matter either way, right?
Oh, sure. And as most certainly we've had inquiries about, hey, we want to put, and these products exist, although shelf life can be an issue. We want to put 80 proof whiskey into a can, but have had some problems. Can you provide some guidance? There was also an interesting paper that came out about, we didn't do it, another group did, about putting hand sanitizer with, 80% alcohol into a can. That doesn't work very well, by the way. The ethanol swells the liner. The liner's a plastic, and the ethanol actually swells it up, blows it up like a balloon, and it doesn't function very well as a liner anymore.
That explains a lot. I spilled some in my Buick on the plastic console during COVID. I barely got it all cleaned up, and it ruined it for good. I had to replace the liner, the console. But so where does that put you then? What's the end game with trying to extend? And let me go back to an example. I tasted, 5 years ago, I decided to put out a special on canned wines. And I went through a lot, probably 100 different brands, all the stuff you see on the shelf. And I found some pretty good wines. I found appellated Cabernet from California, from Lodi. I found vintage Pinot Noir from Monterey. I found good Chardonnay. And you're right. The biggest problem was this hydrogen sulfide character coming out of the wines. And it seemed like those wines, even 5 years ago, were put in the can. Go ahead, put in a can. No one's going to care. And that seems to be evolving into more sophisticated things. However, when COVID, the year before COVID, I did it. During COVID, I went to find more, and they clearly were the same wines I had tasted a year earlier. They had not come up with new, fresher samples. It was obvious because the wines did not have the character that they started with, and it was just an older character. So the end game for your department is to create longevity, 24 months, 36 months. Like what value is it when we know that a canned wine is probably consumed in the first 24 months that it's canned? Yes. Is that the objective?
So in the short term, one of the problems we're working on is we want to get at least 6 months without too much concern. I mean, that's a bare minimum, considering that wine's a vintage product, and you don't usually want to do multiple canning runs unless you have to. So getting at least 6 months is good. And the guidance we've been able to provide winemakers with respect to that is the problematic agent is sulfites. And specifically, it is a form of sulfites called molecular SO2, which is favored at low pH. And so we could provide them updated guidelines for maximum molecular SO2 levels to use, which made sense because they didn't need to worry as much about SO2 when they were going into cans, because cans provide this amazing hermetically sealed environment. So they don't have as much issues with oxygen pickup. And they were often using guidelines based on what to use for cork finished wines, and they often were putting in more than they needed. Okay, so that's the short term. Good. I feel pretty comfortable providing guidance to a winemaker of who wants to have a wine that lasts 6 to 12 months about whether their wine should be able to withstand that, and what changes they might need to make if it won't. Going longer than that, I recall in the early in discussions about screw caps, and you brought up Gallo's products, and then this goes locally as well. Early on with screw caps, the only wines that went under screw cap were the lowest price point wines. And if you ask winemakers why, like, is there something wrong with screw cap? Like, if we put our premium red under a screw cap, a customer looks at that and says it must be a cheap wine.
Mm-hmm.
It's under screw cap. We're not going to put a wine that we're hoping to sell for 30 plus under screw cap because no consumer is willing to pay for that.
Mm-hmm.
And this mindset was not unique to upstate New York. You could find this throughout the country. I know California had a few early adopters like Plumpjack, but it was unusual to see premium or ultra premium wines under screw cap until very recently. And New Zealand led a lot of that by showing that you could not just have high quality wines, but even higher quality wines because of the consistency, because of such a good auction barrier. So longer term, if a can delivered as good performance as a bottle, do I see it replacing bottles for all circumstances? You brought up the aesthetic considerations. I will, and so beyond that, there may be reasons why some wineries want to do a portion in cans. Right now, we don't have 750 ml cans as a common format. But what if you're the kind of wine collector that doesn't want to invest in 750 mils of everything? What if you wanted smaller formats and you wanted to cellar them because of curiosity? What if you wanted to put away, instead of 750s, you wanted to put away 375s or 187s? Maybe this is opening up opportunities for long-term wine storage that wouldn't have been available if you were relying only on glass packaged wines, where 750 dominates, and it's hard to find. Maybe you find some magnums from 375s, but this gives you a different format to have for storing wines for longer term. It could be that, at the very least, I'd like to know that any winery that wants to put their wine in can can do so, and isn't having this barrier created of not being able to do that because of concerns of quality degradation. Most wines are not designed to be put away for 5 or 10 years. Mm-hmm. Even if they're being put away for a year or two, you'd still like to know that you're not going to have product failure during that time. And I don't want to see wineries turning away from this option because they're concerned that it might happen.
You heard me laugh because when I sold the company a few months ago, the buyer wanted nothing to do with my premium wines, which were somewhere around 2,000 bottles worth. Mm-hmm. And because my marketplace as a vendor was not that, but I collected them during COVID because during COVID, they would buy anything I asked them to buy. And I threw a few things in there for myself, of course. Mm-hmm. But now I got to store them because, and I don't have the storage at home. So I built a cellar in our kitchen. I threw some glass walls up. But I just had this vision of this racking, which I built the whole 1,800 bottles. But instead of a bottle and a cap on the outside, I got a can, with a flip. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't imagine what that's going to look like when I do that. But it's funny. I want to interrupt you, but I had this thought, and I want to lose it. When they're putting, and we're almost done here, but the idea of, let's say, a plastic bottle, and this is one of the perception issues I think plastic has. Whole Foods had Pool Boy out there for a while, and it was a 1 liter bottle, but it's plastic, so it looks like a 750 as far as its size on the shelf. And I don't think the consumer understands the difference between a liter and 750 anyway. But you're getting 25% more wine by getting it in a plastic liter. But the difference in that is, if I'm a restaurant and I can buy a 36 pack of a wine in a liter that weighs, or even a 30 pack that weighs the same as a 12 pack. And I'm pouring it from behind the curtain anyway. Mm-hmm. I mean, for a house pour, I don't see why you wouldn't do that, because all the economies of scale are going to come in your favor buying a 30 pack than a 12 pack. And so I think it has value, marketing value to a restaurateur. It would have been to me if I stuck around in this business, but it's kind of an interesting problem. The reason I brought up is if you walk down the shelf and you see a 1 liter, because if you put a 750 out there in plastic, it looks like a 500. But you put a 1 liter out there, it looks like a 750. So I grab it. Oh, it's plastic. But I don't think I'm getting more wine at this point. It's kind of a situation.
Yeah. I think that's also, I mean, the service side is an important one to consider. In restaurants for the house pour, to use something like bag-in-box or Tetra Pak can make a lot of sense, because there's no, if the customer is never going to see the packaging, it gives you the flexibility to use the package as you need it. Bag-in-box is particularly good for that because the packaging collapses around the wine as it's used. Bag-in-box is not good for longevity unopened. The shelf life unopened is like 6 to 12 months. But once you open it, unlike a bottled wine where the concern is, unless you've got some way to protect that wine with inert gas, within a few days to a week, depending on the temperature it's stored at, you worry about quality loss, maybe even less than that. Bag-in-box, you can easily get, especially if it's stored cold, couple weeks, few weeks, maybe even a month, because there's so much less oxygen ingress. Again, it's not going to help you if you don't use the product, but if you do use it, that makes a lot of sense for bars, restaurants that might have occasional wine consumers, but want to make sure they got something around.
Okay, we're at 57 minutes, but I got to ask you a question and wrap this up. Actually, on that point, really quickly, I was at the Monterey Concord Elegance, and we were sitting at a bar, and some brilliant bartender had put big black felt pen dates on the house pours. And I knew they were in Wells, one of the big distributors, house pour. And so while I was sitting there drinking my martini, the waitress came up and says, "I need a glass of Pinot." And he just turned around, didn't even look, and grabbed this Pinot Noir, which was already 2 weeks old that the last time it had been used. And he pours it right in front of me as the waitress says, and I said, "That's coming back." He goes, "What do you mean, sir?" I said, "Well, look at the date." He goes, "Oh, dude, sorry, thanks for alerting me to this."
Yeah,
because there's no way. All right, this is a quick book since you're in the industry in regards to biology and things. It's called "Wine is the Best Medicine." It's written by a MD in France in the 70s, and he was also a homeopathic doctor. And he's got a list of maladies here, human maladies, and 3 reasons you should. I'm going to give you 3 choices of a symptom relief or maybe even cure for your malady, but they're all French wine. So I'll give you that much. I'll give you that kind of clue. And let's just say that you have an allergy of some sort. You can have a glass of a Medoc, you could have a Beaujolais or dry champagne. And there's a dosage factor with this too. But so what would you recommend for an allergy? A Medoc?
Well, he's homeopathic. So what feels like, remind me, with homeopathic, I'm trying to do like with like, right? Just diluted. So which of those 3 wines most reminds me of an allergy? I think that's supposed to be the rationale here.
I suppose.
Yeah, I don't know. Champagne's got an irritating quality from the bubble, so I'll go with that one.
Okay, now, see, this is important stuff because it's just like when you take the test for the MW, the MS, the answer is important to know if you get it right, but it's also how did you come up with that answer? And that's probably just as important as, and you're one of the first to really sort of explain this concept. Most people don't think, but that was wrong. It's a Medoc. And now let's see what he says. Allergic reactions so common nowadays are frequently linked with medicinal toxins, which sensitize the subject not only to the medicine, but also to natural substances which were once harmless. They represent modifications caused by the body, blah, blah. Because the wine is rich in natural potassium, this alkaline metal in small doses acts on water excretion problems. That make sense?
Yeah, it was completely clear.
Now,
hey, did you hear? Are your guests allowed to tell jokes on the air?
Sure, of course, yes.
So,
yeah, absolutely.
Did you hear the one about the homeopathic doctor who drank water? He died of an overdose. Okay. Carry on.
It does go around the halls of Cornell, I guess, right?
Oh, yeah. That was from Cornell chemistry back when I was over there.
That's funny. Gavin, thank you so much for the time today. We have plenty to talk about if we get to do this again. And say hi to my intern and good friend, Lisa. And
oh, yeah.
Since you were talking about your prefaces to your students, her parents planted 100 vines in their vineyard here in the San Fernando Valley, and got the bug. And they
Fantastic.
have created a brand. And against my best recommendation to get into this industry. And so I told her, I said, would you please learn something from Gavin and then talk some sense into your parents? So thank you again for the time.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to speak, Paul.
Cheers. Talk to you later. Bye-bye. Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Carey. Don't forget to subscribe because there's more great interviews on their way. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.